Well, how are you, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. We have an interesting case before the Supreme Court concerning the Tennessee law that bans gender affirming care for minors. And so they're kicking it around the Supreme Court, hearing the different arguments. And personally, it's sort of sad and ridiculous that we're having this conversation. Whether or not we can ban children from, in my opinion, being mutilated. You have minors who have been given hormones, puberty blockers, in some cases surgery, that can potentially sterilize them forever. And they're making these decisions before they're physically and mentally mature. And again, I think it's quite sick. Now, you think this case would be settled 9-0, right? Well, it doesn't look like that. There are a couple of judges, shocker, on the left, who are making some arguments to suggest that they will vote against upholding this ban. And the two justices are Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson. And Ketanji Brown Jackson is actually suggesting that this ban violates the 14th Amendment on equal protection. How? I'm not quite sure, but that's where she's leaning. And then you have Sotomayor, who is saying that pointing out that this treatment has risk is not a good argument because every drug has risk, and just because there are some bad outcomes doesn't mean you ban something. Well, that's funny because we actually have studies about beta blockers and how they affect children. And this study was actually done by somebody who was very, very pro-trans. And she ended up not releasing the study because she was worried that conservatives would grab onto it and, in her words, weaponize it, because her study showed that this treatment did not help children as far as depression and suicide. And this was reported in the New York Times. The U.S. study on puberty blockers goes unpublished because of politics. Doctor says the leader of the long-running study said that the drugs did not improve mental health in children with gender distress, and that the findings might be weaponized by opponents of the care. So we have actual studies showing that this care doesn't help, and this lady tried to hide it. Very disgraceful, in my opinion, especially since this study was funded by our U.S. tax dollars. And another thing that's funny about this gender-affirming care is that people always think that Europe is more progressive than the United States, and that we're sort of trailing behind the more wise Europeans who are more sophisticated. Well, in Europe, in most countries, this care is actually banned for minors because they themselves have already discovered that it's actually counterproductive and hurts children. So we're actually further left than the Europeans on this issue. So we should be embarrassed. Now, when it comes to these far left issues, one thing I notice is that conservatives are often blindsided when they pop up. And one of the more recent examples is critical race theory. So, 4 or 5 years ago, it pops up on people's radar. It's showing up in schools, and conservatives are going, what the hell is this stuff? Where is this coming from? And they're again completely blindsided by it. Well, in actuality, critical race theory is decades old. It was created back in the 70s by a group of intellectuals who were unhappy with the results of the civil rights movement, which they thought didn't go far enough, and they came up with critical race theory. But it took decades for it to actually show up to the point where conservatives became aware of it. And it's the same thing with this gender affirming care, which kind of falls under the umbrella of queer theory. Queer theory has been around for a very long time, but it hasn't been until recent that it's become just exploding. Where I think right now 25% of kids classify themselves as being queer or non-binary, which is a massive number, 25%. Clearly, this is not a natural occurring thing. This is being pushed by educators, by the school system, by pop culture. That's what's driving this rise in kids identifying as non-binary or queer or transgender. So it's not organic at all, and it's rising very, very fast, which is why we need to put the brakes on it. Another thing that's interesting is that these theories, critical race theory, queer theory, gender affirming care, anything that's sort of far left, the right immediately calls Marxist. And in the case of critical race theory, it certainly has Marxist roots. But when it comes to queer theory, gender affirming care, interestingly enough, the Marxists actually reject it as being part of Marxism. They say, no, this really doesn't come from our way of thinking. In fact, the Marxists will criticize queer theory as being in essentially irrational, being idealism, postmodernism. So classifying it as gender affirming care as Marxism isn't quite correct. But to really show that, I want to reference an article that is from Marxist.com titled Marxism versus Queer Theory. And this is a very, very long article, very interesting. I will actually post a link in the description. But there are just a couple of parts that really show where queer theory comes from according to Marxists. And this is what they say here. Feminist theories that portray class struggles as secondary to the cultural struggle against patriarchy, or that deny the existence of class struggle altogether, gained influence. It was no longer about fighting against class society and women's oppression rooted within it, but about fighting against trans-historical patriarchy, in essence, remaining the same throughout different forms of society. The revolutionary subject was no longer the working class, but women oppressed by man. From this premise, an abundance of texts and discussions were launched that dealt with the question of the essence of patriarchy and how women, who have become the main subject of analysis, could be defined. The idea of differentiating between biological sex and social acquired gender became prominent. It is expressed in Simone de Beauvoir's, if that's right, emblematic remark, "One is not born, but rather becomes woman. No biological, physical, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between the male and the unit that is called feminine. Only the mediation of another can contribute or constitute an individual as an other." Here, the article goes on, "We already see the roots of what will later become central ideas of queer theory. The woman, as such, does not exist. She is only shaped and brought up to become one by society." So, woman, gender, according to queer theory, are social constructs, but the Marxists, again, don't quite agree, and they go on to say, "The claim of queer theory and subjective idealism that the whole world is a cultural construct contradicts our daily experience, which is that sexes are real, as sexual reproduction proves on a daily basis, and further, that the physical world follows its daily business quite independently of our language. Nevertheless, for some, queer theory is seen as a useful tool with which to perceive the world. So, just because we change the language doesn't mean we change reality. There are sexes, there is sexual reproduction, and you cannot just change that because you manipulate how we describe things. So interesting. The Marxists are going, nah, we don't quite buy into this. Now, Marxists will still work with people who follow queer theory because they have a common enemy and they're generally moving in the same direction. So while they say philosophically we don't buy this and it's not Marxism, we can still work together. We are our fellow travelers. So funny to see here that even our orthodox Marxists look at these ideas about gender and go, doesn't quite make sense. And it's, that's what's really so frustrating about this whole topic of gender affirming care, especially for minors. It shouldn't even be something we have to really break down. It should be just obvious that this is clearly wrong and clearly a child abuse. And in my opinion, people who engage in this should be tossed in jail. And another element of this is how it gets credibility is you have the American Psychological Association, or the AMA, the American Medical Association, and oftentimes the proponents of gender affirming care will point out that these organizations support it. Well, in the case of psychologists, have you noticed that some of the craziest people you will ever meet are psychologists? For example, you got Blasey Ford, who was the accuser against Brett Kavanaugh in his hearing for the Supreme Court. She's a nut job. She's a psychologist. And then you have Mary Trump, who is Donald Trump's niece, who viciously attacks him and is clearly mentally ill herself. And what is she? She is a psychologist. So pointing out that psychologists say that gender affirming care is needed doesn't really strike me as a good argument, seeing as these people themselves are a little crazy and politically motivated in many cases. So here we are, 2024, having debates about whether or not we're going to sterilize children because they claim that they are transgendered. And of course, the reality is that it is adults who put these ideas into children's heads. That's where they come from. It is not organic. And that's where the right use that term, groomer, which the left hates, or pointing out is that these children who are 5 years old who are trans or want to do drag or are gender non-conforming, these ideas are planted in their heads by sick parents and sick teachers who are leading them down this path toward to Crazyville. That's where it's coming from. When I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, this stuff simply didn't exist. There was no kid that I knew that was in the wrong body. It's preposterous. But now all of a sudden, it's showing up, and it's because we have some very sick adults. So I agree with Senator Mike Lee. He made this comment on X, and he says this because there was a female to male individual who claims that he knew of children as young as 2 who were in the wrong gender. 2 years old. That's some pretty sick stuff. And Mike Lee says there's a place where people who mutilate kids belong, and it is called prison. And he is 100% right. Mutilating kids you deserve to go to prison. And for me, children, they're my red line. It is the duty of a society to protect children before anything else. And if we can't do that, we as a society have completely failed. Now, if you're an adult like this individual is, and you want to take hormones and transition, it's a free country. You're an adult. Do what you want. But when you introduce this stuff to children, that's where you cross the line. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of Mike Lee, we should toss your ass in prison. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.